Hello and thank you for joining this BIM Coordinators Summit virtual presentation, BIM Tools for Element Classification and Data Validation. My name is Brian Smith and I am a solution consultant at Invicara. If you're not familiar with Invicara, we're based in Ireland. However, we have team members all over the world. I'm actually located on the east coast of the United States in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And at Invicara, we are focused on the development of our digital twin platform. So I hope you had a chance to catch our CEO, Anand Mancheri's presentation on demystifying the digital twin earlier. My background goes back to working with CAD in architecture and MEP, followed by a number of years consulting within the Autodesk reseller channel to now, almost in my 7th year at Invicara. I'm happy to be presenting at this event, and thank you for letting me get a little BIM geeky with you today. So, project requirements. It seems that project requirements are becoming more data critical, and specifications are becoming more elaborate as our industry strives to work smarter. We're expecting more out of our models for longevity and how the models and model data will be used after building handover. The roles of data consumers are more broad as our model data makes its way into facilities management system, digital twins. We have the need to visualize real-time IoT sensor data. The list continues to grow. I mean, that's very exciting, right? One of the issues we'll look at is model element classification. Now, most projects that we see don't use just one single classification system, but several in order to tell the whole story. This is normally a mixture of industry standard systems like OmniClass, Uniclass, Master Format, and custom classification systems to aid in other areas like cost estimating, scheduling, parameter assignments, and so on. This leads to our second issue, required parameters, another area that's evolving. The list of required parameters for various departments and purposes continues to grow and is increasingly more difficult to manage. So let's say you have all your parameters in the building model and everything looks right, but is it? You know what it's like to find that first piece of data in a model that's obviously incorrect, right? You immediately become concerned about all the other data. Staring at schedules and spreadsheets is one of the most popular, yet ineffective ways to check your data. This is where our tools come in. We're going to be looking at these data management tools to address those issues. And don't worry, I'm not going to PowerPoint you to death. This is my last slide for now. But you will see how model element classification is simplified with our BIM Classify product. We will summarize our element classification systems and use them to assist us in required parameter assignment and creation in our defined product. And I'll give you a glimpse at our approach to data validation with our Validate product, which is currently in development. I'll also be using Revit as our model authoring platform and with our add-ins. So let's jump in. What is BIM Classify? So BIM Classify has two main parts, a web portal for setup and configuration, and an authoring platform plugin used to classify our model elements. You can see I'm using Revit here, but we also support Civil 3D. And beginning with the end in mind, let's look at this light fixture in the model and its type properties. Now, classification systems. Classification systems typically have two parts, a code and a description, that can be together in a group or separated. Here, we're using a combination of classification systems as most projects we see are now requiring. IFC classification using both IFC entity and IFC enumeration, which kind of gives us a quick way of identifying and sorting element types. For much more detail, we're using industry standard Uniclass. You can see the code and description there. And we're using a custom operations class system to identify if an element is maintainable, operationally significant, and so on. We could also be using the uniclass SS and SL tables for systems and spaces, but right now our goal is to get these classification codes and descriptions in for all modeled elements. The BIM Classify portal serves as a centralized repository of all the classification systems as opposed to, a bunch of standalone plugins. This becomes critical when you have what could be hundreds of people working on the same project at the same time. The portal allows administrators to give access to the projects and set up classification systems for the classifiers that will be using the plugin. So those with the administrator roles may not be the same people as with the classifier roles. So if I look here with the classification systems and use this dropdown, you'll see the same classification systems we were just looking at. We have our IFC entity and enumeration and our uniclass and operations class. I'm going to come here into our mappings area and over to map by model. When classifying, our first goal is to get our primary codes in the element, in our case the IFC entity and enumeration codes. With map by model, we can analyze all the Revit family and type combinations grouped by Revit category and create a set of rules of sorts that we call mappings, which are used when the classifier asks for recommendations. Once we have assigned our primary classifications, we can use what are called equivalencies. And an equivalency lets us relate one classification system to another. Here you can see if the enumeration value is called grill, then the entity value is IFC air terminal, and it can be one of these 5 or 6 different uniclass codes, and it should be operationally significant from our operations class. And by the way, remember I mentioned this operations class is what's going to be helping us with our required parameter assignments. So with our classification system set up, let's take a quick look at Define. Much like BIM Classify, Define is also made up of 2 parts. This portal for configuration and an authoring plugin, which will create the required parameters in our model. At the top, you can see how our classification systems have been organized and designated primary and secondary. And you can see how operations class is being used to help with required property type assignments. Down here at the bottom, you can see if we're calling an element operationally significant, that element is going to receive all these groups of properties: specification, COBie, and BIM form LOD. When looking at the requirements for an air terminal, for example, I can see what the specification parameters are, COBie, LOD, each of the parameter types and the grouping so that Revit knows how to set them up if they don't already exist. So back to classification. Remember, our first goal is to get our primary classification system in. Now, I could go to an element and add it to the workboard, assign our entity, then operation class, and I'll search for downlight for uniclass, and that would be fine. We can speed things up though by utilizing all of the other work we did in BIM Classify with our mappings and equivalencies. So this time, I'm going to tell BIM Classify to grab all of the air handlers in the model. Instead of manually assigning the classification values, I'm going to ask for recommendations. First, for entities and enumerations. Then for operations class, easy. For unit class, remember we had some choices. I'll pick grill, that's fine. You can see everything's been populated. And now, since we have that operations class code, we can add our required parameters. So here, I'll go up and click check. It's found everything that had that operations class code and added all the required parameters that we had set up in Define. So now we'll go take a look at the type properties for this again. We can see all of the new required parameters have been added. Moving over here, you can see all of the instance properties as well. So next in the process would be for the modeler or subject matter expert to fill in all the required parameter data. Next in the tool chain would be validate. Validate is currently in development, but real quickly, validate will pick up in the overall process of validating the parameter values with different validators, taking into account the validation phases and responsible parties. With a series of different validators, we'll be able to test if the parameter exists, does it have a value, is it the expected value, is it in the correct format, and so on. Then we can indicate at what phase does each parameter need to be validated. COBie parameters in phase 6, LOD in phase 7, and so on. And we'll indicate who was responsible for the different element types if we determine there's an issue with a parameter value. Doors and windows are owned by the architect, HVAC equipment by the MEP, engineer, and so on. Finally, once validation is run against the model, we'll be able to report the results and send that report to the appropriate responsible party. So this brings me to the end of our presentation on our data management tools, BIM Classify, Define, and Validate. With the few minutes that we have left, we can now open this up to questions. And by the way, if you're here at the event, please stop by and say hello to my teammates at the Invicara booth. So any questions?